Night isn't something you feel. Night is something that your friends and family notice. They're often very glad to sort of notice that you're going down a bit. But they tell you you look wonderful. The only thing I notice is that I don't walk as fast as I used to. And I don't run for buses. At least not very often. I first started writing in bed in my Paris days. I think it was probably in the first apartment I had there, where my bed was in a heated room, so that it was comfortable to write in bed. And from that time on, I did a great deal of work in bed, still do. You see, I believe, as the French medical profession seems to, that the nervous system is really only at rest in bed. Now, certain things I don't write in bed. I don't write with ink. I'm too neat a housekeeper for that. But the original pencil creation is what I do in bed. And in the course of a long life, I've collected about 10,000 pages of original holograph manuscripts. Much of it written in bed. I don't work as much in bed as I used to, actually. Maybe I've stayed in bed long enough. I've lived here since 1940. Oh, before that, I knew Thomas Wolfe, who lived here, too. But that was back in the 30s. A few years ago, the management proposed to me that they should put up a plaque in my honor. And I said, you don't put up plaques for anybody that's still living. Plaques are for dead people. They got Jim Farrell's name on a plaque because he had moved away from the hotel and they thought he must be dead. But I said, you're not going to put my name on the front of this hotel as if I were in business here, though I may be. People ask me, am I a part of the American School of Composers? Of course I am. I'm one of its founders. Oh, I know. The machine is in the sweater. That's where that is. That's it. Well, my hearing problem is a problem not so much in writing music as it is in hearing it, because the nature of my particular deafness is such that the music which I hear is all off pitch. If I play the piano, what my fingers do is quite different from what my ears hear. So that I write music as all deaf people have to, really, out of the memory of how everything sounds. I began my music life as a pianist and an organist. And in my middle years, I did a great deal of conducting, too. I no longer conduct because I can't hear balances correctly. But up to about 10 years ago, I still took conducting dates. And always I've been involved with either writing about music or writing words into music. In 1940, when I came from France, I started working for the New York Herald Tribune. I stayed there for 14 years as their principal music critic. And I had fun. They liked me and I liked them. They didn't interfere with me, but they gave me good counsel here and there about how to, if you want to be really destructive, you keep your manners about you. After all, composers know more about music than anybody else. And it's always a help if you're reviewing something to know about what you're reviewing. I had learned to be quite a good writer, partly at Harvard, but even more energetically in the high schools of Kansas City. Oh, yes. Shall I read it? It's called Shower of Gold. Wanda Landowska's harpsichord recital of last evening at the town hall was as stimulating as a needle shower. Indeed, the sound of that princely instrument, when it's played with art and fury, makes one think of golden rain and of how Danae's flesh must have tingled when she found herself caught out in just such a downpour. Do you want me to go on? Well, this is about a concert of the New York Philharmonic conducted by Dmitri Mitropoulos, who was a terribly good conductor, really. But every now and then he would get nervous, as they often do, and start gesticulating. Says, actually, when the conductor, in moments of calm, conducted straightforwardly and with a minimum of motion, his orchestra followed with a maximum of beauty and with the authority of style that is our Philharmonic's way. But for the most part, he did everything to the orchestra but conduct it. He whipped it up as if it were a cake, kneaded it like bread, shuffled and riffled an imaginary deck of cards, wound up a clock, shook a recalcitrant umbrella, rubbed something on a washboard and wrung it out. Really, there were very few moments when a film taken with the conductor alone, without sound, would have given any clue to the fact that he was directing a musical composition. Well, that's me being a little bit naughty, but somebody's got to answer the telephone, you know. Kansas City, Missouri in 1896. That's a long time ago. When I was 2 or 3 years old, I used to stand at the piano with my foot on the loud pedal and bang around, making lots of noise. Sometimes I could make the same effect different times, and I would call those pieces. I didn't write them down, of course. They sounded like banging around to my family. I remember I used to play something called the Chicago Fire. One heard about it, and so a child could illustrate it. Naturally, nobody starts by being a composer. Any musician starts by playing an instrument. I learned to read words and and music in the same year when I was 5. I started writing music in my teens. The years between 12 and 18 are the big years for progress anyway, because your hand is formed by that time. Well, I left home, so to speak, when I joined a regiment in World War I. It was a local guard regiment of mounted artillery, the same one that Harry Truman was in. Only I was a buck private and he was a captain. And then after that, I went off to a fine, fancy Eastern college known as Harvard University. Well, in those days, everybody wanted to go to Paris. World War I was over, and people didn't go to Germany to study yet because there wasn't anything to eat in Germany. People went to Berlin for sex, but Paris had a whole new school of composers of its own, and all the old ones, and then, of course, there were the literary people living there, James Joyce and Gertrude Stein, and the Americans poured in by the hundreds. So it was the place to go. And I got myself a traveling fellowship from Harvard to pay for it, and so I just went. I always felt particularly at home in Kansas City and in Paris because they were kind of like each other, with rather good food and lots of religion and good food and general corruption around. Every time you do anything a little bit out of line, somebody thinks you're being daring. The most daring thing in the world would be not to do anything out of line. That would be extremely dangerous. If a young composer has no opposition, of course he's not a very good composer. Any kind of originality or authentic talent starts off by being a little shocking because it's unexpected. And by mere age and persistence, you have acquired something like a license to continue. I haven't always lived at 17 Quai Voltaire, only for the last 50 years. When I first came to Paris in 1921 as a music student, I lived near the Place Clichy, and I was having lessons from Nadia Boulanger, who lived near there, lessons in counterpoint and in organ playing. Nadia Boulanger was very little known to Americans, and in France she was simply a teacher of harmony at the conservatory. It turned out, of course, that she had a great knack for handling Americans. I went to her, found it was just fine by me, and for the year of 1921-22, she had 3 American students, Melville Smith, Aaron Copland, and myself. Then I went back and taught at Harvard for a while and played the organ in Boston. In 1925, I decided I didn't want to be surrounded by other people's music all the time. So I came back with practically no money, but on the general principle that Paris was where I lived, and should live, and worked the best. And as I said to friends at the time, if I were going to starve, at least I could starve where the food was good. Food was good and still was good and still is good. The weather was bad and still is bad. The only difference between 1921, when I first saw Paris, and 1986, which is now, oh my, that's, what, 55 years or something, 65, I guess, is that Paris is now a blonde. Paris was a brunette when I first knew her, and she stayed brunette through the last war. And then afterwards they started washing everything. So now the stone is all various colors, from pale cream to camembert cheese. And Paris, it's very becoming to Paris to be a blonde. I didn't really want to occupy myself with anything but my own music. That concentration actually bore fruit, because within a year I was writing with the greatest of ease and pleasure, and I think well. I wrote organ music, chamber music, I wrote string quartets and violin sonatas, and a symphony. My symphony on a hymn tune comes from that time. And actually, as I wrote the symphony in 4 movements, each movement turns out to be a set of variations on the same tune. It's an old Southern tune. Southern Baptist conventions raised the roof with it. And I chose as a sort of a contrasting tune, something that might sound like a Haydn rondo finale, but which is actually a little Sunday school tune called Yes, Jesus Loves Me. With false notes. Oh, my music is sewn through and through with religious music of all kinds. I've never taken very well to religion itself, but I love religious music.
My master hath a garden full filled with divers flowers, where thou mayst gather posies gay. All time
pieces?
Oh, I've written a lot of music in the last few years. I just go on and on. Every now and then I get onto a portrait binge, and I do a whole batch of them again. I started making musical portraits in 1927, when I was about 30 years old. I got the idea of doing it, so to speak, from Gertrude Stein, who made poetry or prose portraits of her friends and acquaintances. As a matter of fact, there's a long musical history in portraiture, from Couperin in the 18th century through Schumann and various composers in the 20th. They all made their portraits in the absence of the sitter, as far as I know. I did my first 6 in the absence of the sitter, and then I asked one of my friends to pose, and after that, I always wrote them from a live pose, because I found that the imagination took off much more easily, and the resemblance, if you want to call it that, or suggestion of the sitter's personality came out better in the music. I'm going to show you a little bit of the Picasso portrait. When I went to his house to make the portrait, he was very curious about the procedure. He said, "How do you make musical portraits?" I said, "The same way as you would make a portrait of me in drawing. You would look at me and then draw what you see. I look at you and then I write down on music paper what I hear." He said, "Oh yes, of course, it's obvious. If I am working and you're in the room, anything I do is automatically your portrait." I call this Bugles and Birds. As you say, there's brass music and bird music. There is a piano sonata which I wrote back about 1930 or 31, somewhere in there, which I discovered later was really a self-portrait. So to myself, I call it a portrait of the artist as a young man. At 20, you have different things on your mind from what you have at 90. Maybe not so different, but a little bit. Now, inside, everybody more or less is the same forever. But you don't always know your own inside, and other people don't get much view of it either. Every now and then it comes out unexpectedly in your work as a surprise to you all. Right off, when I started to write music for documentary films, I adopted a method of composition, that is to say, of choice of materials for composition, that I've always preserved, which is to use for whatever people are depicted, and by people I mean real people doing real things, to accompany them by folk music or their own music. For the West, with its horses and its cowboys, I used straight cowboy music, like this. I knew Père Laurence in 1936, or about January, I guess, through John Houseman. Père had just finished making a film which he called The Plow That Broke the Plains, which was all about dust storms, and he needed some music for it. And he told me about his film and how little money he had, but how beautiful the film was. And I asked him, well, how much money have you got? That's what sold me to him, because he had talked with several of my colleagues about writing music for the film, and he said, those guys didn't talk about anything but aesthetics. You talked about money. That means you're a professional. The next year, he had a little more money to make a film to be called The River, and it was about the enormous floods in the Mississippi Valley. It was here, as a matter of fact, at the Chelsea Hotel that I knew Robert Flaherty, with whom I collaborated on the film Louisiana Story. He had made the film in Louisiana, and Helen Van Dongen was his cutter. We started talking about the kind of film it is, and gives a chance for a great deal of music of the kind I like to write. I also procured for him the services of the Philadelphia Orchestra and Eugene Ormandy to conduct it. That's why it sounds so wonderful in the film. That may be why I got a Pulitzer Prize for writing that score. Actually, it's the only film score that ever won a Pulitzer Prize. I rather enjoy growing old. I like being old because you wake up in the morning. The young can, with the greatest of ease, sleep till noon, but I wake up at 6 or 6:30, bring in the New York Times, and read it in bed with a cup of coffee. I enjoy that. And there are a great many things I don't have to do. The young all have to take exercise, otherwise they die. I don't need that much exercise. I can spend whole days in my flat reading and writing and having a nap between sessions. I think you have to work all your life. I think if you don't work, people don't like you. Nobody likes a lazy man. And if you want to be loved, you have to work. They love you for working, whether they like your work or not. And eventually, if you produce enough of it and live long enough, they like your work. They get used to it, you know. Filling Station was choreographed and danced by Lou Christensen in 1937. The sets and costumes were designed by the painter Paul Cadmus, and it stayed in the repertory of what is now the New York City Ballet. It was called Ballet Caravan in those days. Then it was revived, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, for Jacques d'Amboise, who was their new and brilliant male dancer. When he got to be 19 years old, they revived this for him, and he played it in New York.
Well, to do a ballet for yourself is quite difficult, you know, because you don't know what you look like, actually. Because we used to do it piece by piece, we'd talk it over and go,
Yes.
It's almost like making a film now.
Well, I had not written a ballet before, and I think you probably hadn't choreographed one before.
Not with original music. And actually, I almost watched you compose the music, and you almost watched me choreograph it all the way through.
And like all choreographers, you would stand in the middle of your dances and say, now do this.
So you sort of improvise with your own body. That's how you do it.
Yes, yes. Why, it's an evening in the life of a filling station attendant. He listens to the radio, and various people come in for their needs. A couple of truck drivers that go by regularly come in, and there's a family of a man and wife and a rather nasty little girl. She has to go to the toilet. Then there's a young couple, a little bit drunk. They've come from a dance at the local country club. In the midst of all this, a gangster comes in and holds up the place. And so the filling station turns out the light. We have a whole dance in the dark with flashlights.
With flashlights, yeah.
Yes, yes. And when the lights are turned on again, the gangster has been arrested by state troopers.
That's right.
And the girl from the country club is dead as a doornail. Looking at my work as you get to do things, as you get older, that is one of the things that it's rather fun. You learn to see yourself and your work a little bit through other people. And I suspect very strongly that I will be remembered for my operas rather than for my symphonic works. My operas are the most different from what other people are doing. Actually, I've only written 3, but if you live long enough, you write more. I seem to write an opera about every 20 years. Let's go backwards on the 3 operas. Lord Byron, which is the last one to be written, was all about the life of a famous poet. Byron is a very interesting man for operatic treatment because he's mythological size, you see. He was not only a poet, but a lord, a millionaire, and a beauty, and a world celebrity. Naturally, with all that running for him, he had to misbehave every day to cut himself down to size. And he got through his life by 36. Jack Lawson, a California poet, wrote the libretto.
Finally, Juilliard, when your 75th birthday was coming up, Juilliard proposed a date and a production.
Yes, yes, Peter Manning did produce it.
Right, with John Houseman directing it.
Yes.
And, well, I had never written a libretto before. The big problem of writing the libretto for me was getting enough of Byron's work into the libretto
to make it seem real.
To make it seem real, to then work on his life level, biographic level, but to be able to get his poetry onto the stage.
Yes.
So the audience was in the presence of Byron's own words.
What then the Abbey is worth the whole collection.
The opera that preceded it was about American political life in the 19th century, about Susan B. Anthony. that, again, mythological time when the whole of American life changed from sort of 18th centuryness into being prematurely 20th century, and all the things got done that needed to be done, and agitation about women's rights. Now, these Gertrude Stein operas, of which this is the second, are all about dominant, almost domineering female characters. Gertrude projected herself and her preoccupations into these. For the first time Gertrude and I ever saw each other, we liked each other. As I said at the time, we got on like old Harvard men. We had so many things we had enjoyed and liked to talk about them. We had both enjoyed Harvard, and we had both enjoyed World War I. It's difficult to explain to anybody today that people enjoyed wars, but World War I was relatively popular, and a great many people enjoyed it. Gertrude was exactly like her photographs. A small, chunky woman. After she cut her hair, she looked a great deal like a Roman emperor. Before that, when she had long hair, she had a kind of bun on the top of her head. And she did not look like a Roman emperor, but she looked like a chunky, intelligent, and possibly friendly woman. She didn't have a mean look. I came about 10 days ago for a ceremony which took place in the street right here for the unveiling of this plaque on the house, which says that she lived there from 1903 to 1938, first with her brother Leo, and later with Alice Toklas, and that they had lots of company, artists and writers. This is the house where Gertrude Stein lived for 35 years, and where I first knew her in 1926. This is the pavilion which constituted what you might call the living quarters of Gertrude Stein, first with her brother and later with Alice Toklas. That is to say, that is where they had company and had their pictures hung on the walls, and that was actually the only part of the house that the visitors ever saw, except possibly the inside of the dining room. She never had any company before 4 o'clock. She wouldn't make engagements for the earlier part of the day in case she might want to write. She said if you fill your day up with engagements, then you're too busy to write. So usually in the morning she would write letters or read, or maybe write a little bit herself, wander around the house and annoy the maid or Alice, and then have a good bath and a lunch. And after the bath, she would go to the garage down at the corner and take out her Ford car, and she and Alice would go somewhere for a little ride. Later, she moved to another house in the Rue Christine. And it was from there that she went away to die. Well, if I had known that death was a possible idea, Gertrude and I might have written an opera every year, or at least every other year, but it just never occurred to either of us that we would both not always be living.
Certainly as regards Four Saints, Virgil was far more than just a composer. He was impresario, producer. He was the Diaghilev of the whole enterprise. We met behind a grand piano at the Askew Salon, to which I'd been taken, as a matter of fact, in order to meet Virgil.
Somebody said to me, "How can you sing Four Saints?" Well, I didn't stop to worry about what Miss Stein meant. Sometimes I didn't think she had a meaning at all. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. It just amused me the way she used the English language. You could sort of roll it around in your mouth.
You know, the first Four Saints cast took to that text, just like ducks to water.
They accepted it as gospel truth, and as far as they were concerned, it made perfectly good sense.
And they conversed in quotations from it.
It seemed to be lucid and crystal clear to them.
What did he say?
What was it that attracted you to her poetry or her words in the first place?
Well, the way they exploded all over the page and all over your mind. The first Gertrude Stein text that I said was a small poem called Susie Asado. And I wrote that out and took it to her as a New Year's present. She was very pleased to be set to music, all poets are.
Yes.
And Alice Douglas, who could read music, which Gertrude couldn't, was also pleased with the music. And after that, we were always friends.
Sweet, 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 sweet tea. Susie Asado. Sweet, 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 sweet tea. Susie Asado. Susie Asado, which is a tone to treasure. A lean of a shoe, this means it slips, slips, hers. When the ancient light gray, it is clean, it is yellow, it is a silver seller. This is a please, this is a please. Drink pops, drink pops, drink pops, Lisa's eyes hold. See it shine and a bubbling has pins. It shows a nail. What is a nail? A nail is unison. Sweet, 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 sweet tea. Is that all right?
Within the next 2 or 3 months, I had put a number of her existing texts to music, and we had begun writing an opera together. It turned out to be The Lives of Spanish Saints. She wrote the libretto, and then I put it to music. I set the whole thing to music, including stage directions. My painter friend, Maurice Grosser, who liked my music and had an unusually strong instinctive understanding of Gertrude's work, she always said so, as a matter of fact, invented a scenario to underpin the whole thing and enable it to be put on stage.
Gertrude had said that one thing was the vision of the Holy Ghost, and another thing was the procession. Do you remember that?
Oh, yes, she knew about those.
That's
but
all there
otherwise,
was.
she gave us no indication of what was happening.
So I made up a Sunday school picnic for the first part.
All the things that you thought up pleased Gertrude a great deal, because she didn't know how to get it on the stage, and she said that the important thing was to get it on the stage.
For the direction of this opera, he didn't want an opera director, and he didn't want a Broadway director. I don't know that he knew exactly what he wanted, but he knew what he didn't want.
And Frederick Ashton, who had come over from London, was choreographing and directing the opera.
Oh, with Freddie I got along with beautifully. And I got along very well with John, too, except one time when I insisted on having a second storm and he didn't want it. Remember that quarrel?
Well, there were all kinds of problems, between creative people. The only sort of screaming that took place was by Alex Mollins, the conductor. Mollins would howl and scream in that sort of strange Scotch Jewish accent that he had. There was the problem of translating Florine's incredibly beautiful models, designs, which were tiny, into a full stage production.
Our sets were made out of cellophane.
The cellophane, which was supposedly flame-proofed, was not.
It wasn't what you think of as transparent cellophane. It was heavy, rather almost opaque, a pale blue.
The night before we opened, the fire department arrived and set fire with a match to a small piece of cyc which they'd cut off, and it flamed and fell to the floor of the stage flaming.
And of course it was a fire hazard.
So they said, absolutely not, you can't open with this.
That was the backdrop.
That was the backdrop.
And it took all kinds of intercessions and about 14 hours of continuous work with some awful sticky substance which rendered it fireproof.
But the black singers, that was your invention, wasn't it?
Oh, certainly. Well, I had the idea at a black nightclub in New York when I had come there in about 32 to prepare the production. And I suddenly realized that they spoke and sang the English language so clearly and so beautifully that I said to Russell Hitchcock, who was with me at the time, I think I'll have an all-black cast for this opera. And he says, well, you better think that over tomorrow. Well, when I woke up tomorrow, I did think it over, and the idea was still a good one, and so I did it that way. Gertrude had never thought of using blacks. She expressed some reserve about over-display of Negro bodies. She had thought that we were going to make this a sort of a sex come-on. You came to my flat in this building very nearly 50 years ago. Well, you said a moment ago that I had played and sung bits of Four Saints for you.
It was so new to me. I only remember that I came out and I thought that I've been in a church and thought that it was extraordinary how Protestant it was, how American it was in that southern sense. It was very special. I had never heard anything like it, and I was astonished.
Among Virgil's friends, and particularly a man called Chick Austin, who ran the Athenaeum in Hartford, there developed an enthusiasm for this piece. I mean, there was no hope of the Met doing anything about it. And to finance it, he created an organization called the Friends and Enemies of Modern Music.
And suddenly I heard something very simple, very childlike, but really very instinctive and real.
It is not so naive. It is not simple. It's terribly sophisticated. On the one hand, it looks easy. It does fall within the range of the voice always. It does suit the line of the words always.
When lots of people used to argue with me about American music, I don't want to name names. I always thought that authentic American music must be like his.
I loved it. Well, I loved it for itself, and Virgil executed it rather brilliantly in his strange way.
Oh, I used to play and sing it for the Friends long before the opera had ever been produced. That's what Russell Hitchcock used to call the Paris production. It was me sitting at a piano at 17 Quai Voltaire and singing the whole thing. I eventually learned to do it from memory, just from having done it so often. St. Teresa in a storm at Avila, there can be rain and warm, snow and warm, that is, the river is warm, the water is not warm, the sun is not warm, and if to stay to cry. Can I do that again? Oh, sure. St. Teresa in a storm at Avila, there can be rain and warm, snow and warm, that is, the river is... I get it all wrong. St. Teresa in a storm at Avila, there can be rain and warm, snow and warm, that is, the water is warm, the river is not warm, the sun is not warm, and if to stay to cry, if to stay to, if to stay to, if to cry to, if having to stay, if to cry to stay, if to cry stay, to cry to stay. St. Teresa half in and half outdoors, St. Ignatius not there, St. Ignatius staying where, never heard them speak of it. St. Ignatius silent, motive not hidden, St. Teresa silent, they were never beset. So one, a calm one, no saint to remember, no saint to remember. St. Teresa knowing, young and told, If it were possible to kill 5,000 Chinamen by pressing a button, would it be done? St. Teresa not interested. Repeat first act. A pleasure, April Fool's Day, a pleasure. St. Teresa seated.
Pigeons on the grass, alas. Pigeons on the grass, alas. Short along the grass, short, longer, shorter yellow grass. Pigeons, large pigeons on the shorter, longer yellow grass, alas. Pigeons on the In a minute, by the time that it is graciously
I never pay any attention to whether things are going to be a success or not. I have to make them a success with myself. I have to like it, what I've done. I don't bother to regret things that I did or didn't do. If you do something that's a mistake, the next operation is not to regret it, but try to make up for the injury that it's done you or somebody else. And if you miss the streetcar, you know, when you should have taken it at some point, or maybe might have taken it, there's no point in regretting that because you don't know what really would have happened. The outcome of everything is the way it happened. And the way it happened is the story of your life.
endless drive to exploit nature